floor is yours.
Kia ora, thank you so much. Welcome from the future, from the very first time zone on this planet, from Wellington, New Zealand. It's 9 o'clock at night here on April the 7th. And I'm thrilled to see that over 100 of you have managed to join this webinar. It is one of the users TCP Academy webinars, and it is about the Hard to Reach Energy Users Annex, which I am the New Zealand operating agent for. And I want to thank Hans and Leonardo specifically for hosting this webinar. Oh, why can I not move my, oops, okay, I have to click on this. Sorry, technical difficulties. I want to start with, us off with the shared goal of this annex, which is to identify, define, and prioritize hard to reach audiences and design, measure, and share effective strategies to engage those audiences to achieve energy demand response and climate targets while meeting access, equity, and energy service needs. And this mouthful of a shared goal was created in collaboration with our national experts and country funders. And on the website, which I've put the link at the bottom, there is a bit of a glossary on some of the terms to describe what they mean for this annex and why we use them. A quick overview of this webinar and its objectives. I want to share some of the findings of the Hard to Reach project to date. It is not even finalized its first year yet. We started in June 2019, and it's a 3-year research project. I want to gather some input from you on who you regard as hard to reach energy users and target audiences, and we're using a very nifty poll function, which Hans is going to help me work during this webinar, so that's going to be interesting. And I want to also talk a little bit about how we can overcome some of the barriers to more effectively engage those audiences from some initial findings of this research. And I'd be remiss not to point out some of the obvious connections between this research and the energy users specifically, and changing behaviours and the pandemic that we're currently dealing with. I don't know about you, but for me, it's very hard not to see everything through a prism of COVID-19. I'm pretty obsessed with reading about it and reading particularly around the various responses around the world and from the participating countries that are funding this research. So Hans, can we please try our poll where I just want to have a very quick and not very scientific poll of who you regard as your top 3 hard to reach energy users or audiences. And I've picked 6 here, and I ask you to rank the top 3, so 1 per question. And those 6 come from some of the research that we've done to date, and these are some of the most commonly mentioned audiences. So if you could please each click on 1 audience per question, a different one preferably, so we can see a little bit later during this talk who you picked as your priority audiences or your target audiences. I'll just give you a minute to do that. And anyone who's got problems with using the poll, please write it in the chat. Okay, I'm gonna continue with the presentation, and I'm gonna ask Hans a little bit later to tell us and show us the results of the poll. So just a very quick overview of where this research annex sits. It sits under the User-Centered Energy Systems Technology Collaboration Program, or TCP, which is part of the International Energy Agency's implementing agreements. There's about 40 such TCPs under these implementing agreements, and almost all of them focus on the supply side or technology. But the user TCP, our mission is to provide evidence from socio-technical research on the design, social acceptance, and usability of clean energy technologies to inform policy making for clean, efficient, and secure energy transitions. And you can see some of the other annexes that are in this TCP, and we've just also signed one off very recently around gender and energy, which I'm super excited about, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of interesting collaborations with this annex. So here are the participants in this research. We currently have 3 financially participating countries who we're super grateful to. Those are Sweden, the US, and New Zealand. And we also have 2 in-kind participating countries, the UK and Canada, who provide very significant in-kind support via our chief science advisors and by co-funding research pilots and field pilots. And then the countries in orange you can see here are those where we had experts who provided us feedback or who responded to our surveys, who we've interviewed, or who provided us case studies or literature for this annex. Each of those user TCP annexes have so-called subtasks, which is how the research is organized. And I shall focus on the subtask 2 specifically today, which is focusing on how to reach definitions and the case study analysis, although this will come in year 2. I'm not going to go into detail here, but I just want to thank very much all of the many project partners and collaborators for this annex who provide us with co-funding and expertise. We couldn't do this work without you, and some of you are online, so extra hello to you guys. Now, who are the hard to reach? In the poll, I've given you a few of the most commonly mentioned examples of hard to reach energy users and asked you to rank some of your priority audiences. And in order to help us undertake a very broad search of all energy users that could be regarded as the hard to reach in different countries, we have collaboratively created this working definition, which is again, unfortunately, a bit of a mouthful. So in this annex, a hard to reach energy user is any energy user from the residential and non-residential sectors who uses any type of energy or fuel, mobility and communication services, and who is typically either hard to reach physically, underserved, or hard to engage or motivate in behavior change, energy efficiency, and demand response interventions that are intended to serve our mutual needs. And again, on the website, there is a glossary of an explanation of what some of these terminologies mean and why we have included, for example, non-residential sectors or communication services. It is obviously too broad to be of much use to policymakers as it stands now, but we started this broad so we can capture all the different audiences and then focus in on characterizing target audiences so they can be prioritized based on the different country contexts and needs. Now, when we started this annex, we hypothesized that this hard to reach group would be greater than 30% of all energy users. When we undertook our interviews with hard to reach experts and policymakers, we had some of them who said they thought it was actually more than half of energy users who were hard to reach with regards to something as broad as this definition. Following the current pandemic, it's a good chance that there will be a lot more energy users from our priority groups like low-income beneficiaries, vulnerable households, and also small businesses who are suffering disproportionately from the economic fallout that we're already witnessing. So there is a good chance that the numbers of energy users who will be more vulnerable and potentially thus regarded as hard to reach will increase a lot, but paradoxically, they could be potentially also less hard to reach because of this crisis. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. That would obviously only be the case if we manage to draw some clear links between, for example, energy efficiency improvements to our housing stock and transport behaviours that can also have immediate health and economic benefits, for example, by providing more employment or new employment to help with the recovery effort. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So this is the research process that we're utilising for this annex, and it is thanks to our project partners, the Sea Change Institute in the US, who I'm a member of, and we will be testing and validating this research process in the field during field research pilots as well. So it is based on design thinking, which is basically the 4 phases: discover, define, design, deploy. And it also includes very robust social science methodology, and we will collect quantitative and qualitative data and triangulate that during each of those phases. And each of those phases also has certain stop gates where we need to fulfill certain requirements before we can move on to the next phase. And the ABCDE building blocks of behavior change refer to audience, behaviors, content and delivery, and evaluation. So the discover phase is where we assessed the needs and opportunities and developed our shared goal, which was the stop gate. And just a very quick overview, in the US and Canada, it is largely utilities who are co-funding this research via the Consortium for Energy Efficiency. They are quite regulated. They're often monopolies. In the US, they're usually investor-owned. In Canada, they're often government-owned, which also means that the funding for energy efficiency programs comes in the US from ratepayer and in Canada from the taxpayer. And the motivations for energy efficiency programs, the recognition that they are more cost effective than building new power plants, but also a lot of mandates and regulation for energy efficiency and low-income households specifically. In New Zealand, the situation is quite different. We are world renowned for having some of the worst housing stock on the planet, especially in the so-called developed world. That of course leads to a lot of issues, particularly around health and comfort, which energy efficiency can address. And so there is a lot of government policies that aim specifically at health and comfort improvements and utilizing things like national insulation subsidies for that. We have a highly deregulated utility sector, and there is inequality between non-residential and residential pricing structures, which is why the government has undertaken an electricity price review specifically aimed at tackling energy hardship. And that is the reason why New Zealand proposed this research, and now is obviously even more interested to see how the connections between the recommendations from this price review and the recovery efforts are going to go. Sweden is quite different again. It has very ambitious energy efficiency motivations and climate and energy targets, a lot of which are set by the EU. It has very ambitious goals around being fossil fuel independent and carbon neutral, and the energy efficiency policies are largely around taxes, subsidies, labelling and codes, and behaviour is mostly confined to experimental settings in utilities and academia. And one interesting comment that came from our Swedish expert was that for researchers in Sweden, utilities can actually be hard to reach energy users and producers, because there is much more of a disconnect between sharing with utilities and researchers than there is, for example, in New Zealand or the US. And the UK is a bit more similar to New Zealand in a lot of ways, but energy is legally recognised as an essential service, and Ofgem is the regulator. The energy efficiency program responsibility lies with energy companies, and there is an energy company obligation, which is funded by levies and which focuses on low income, vulnerable and fuel poor energy users. And large energy suppliers in the UK must promote measures for these households. There is also a government response around cold weather payments, which are one-off payments in winter to over 65s. This has some free rider issues because they go out to all over 65s, and we have the same issue here in New Zealand. We also have energy winter payments, and right now they've been doubled already as part of the recovery package, but obviously they're not necessarily targeting the most vulnerable who need it the most. So what have we learned so far in the discover phase? Our participant goals, even though they have quite different structures of who is focusing on the hard to reach in each of the different countries and how those efforts are funded and undertaken, the goals are actually aligning quite well. Obviously, there are goals around energy efficiency spending and savings and climate targets. There are also obvious goals to increase the program participation by those so-called hard-to-reach energy users. What was really heartening for me when we had our first workshop in the US last November was that there was very strong agreement around the moral obligations to improve equity, energy justice, energy affordability, energy access for all, and also to better conceptualize and frame the hard to reach narrative and go beyond energy poverty, which is kind of like the first place that most people go with it. Also to, draw on this global research collaboration and look at the differences and similarities between hard to reach segments internationally, and assess and learn about behavioural oriented policy and program interventions to address those user groups. So in the define phase, we focus on identifying our target audiences, their barriers and needs, and which behaviours we're actually targeting for change. So we went out to our experts around the world and we asked them questions like, who are your priority hard to reach audiences? Why do you think they're hard to reach? What behaviours do you think are most relevant for this group? What barriers exist that prevent their engagement? And I'd like to see if we can put a quick poll up, Hans. Yes, brilliant. So what is unsurprising as well is that the low-income households and fuel poor come out top with almost half of the respondents, followed by small businesses. And then we're looking at physically isolated and the vulnerable come out as the third. Oh, interestingly, we have low income come out twice as the second highest ranked choice. That is not surprising, I have to say. And it's quite similar to what we found in our research, which I'm going to go into in a second. I just want to note that these results, like so much research data right now, may be colored a little bit by the pandemic, obviously, and may have looked maybe a little bit different before the pandemic or in the future once we have overcome this time period in whichever way possible. Some of the priority and target audiences and their importance may have changed, but there are certain key audiences like the low income, vulnerable and small businesses, which came up here, which have also come up really strongly by the other respondents. So this is these results are from the residential sector, and they're based on our survey, where we had about 120 experts from over 20 countries that responded. And again, the low income came out on top with almost 80% of respondents mentioning them, followed quite closely by non-native speakers and users with literacy barriers. But then what was also quite high was energy users with split incentives, so renters and elderly people. On the right, you can see this word cloud and a non-scientific poll that we did during a kickoff meeting of the annex at the ECEEE summer study with about 30 experts, and the vulnerable and fuel poor came out, and low income came out quite strongly there as well. And in the non-residential sector, small enterprises, same as in your poll, came out really high with over 70% of the respondents, followed by rural businesses and landlords, again hinting at the split incentive issues, and then medium enterprises and building operators and energy managers, which are actually a really interesting group because they have a lot of influence over energy use in commercial buildings. Some more granular findings in the US and Canada. We again found low income coming out as the top priority group, as the top target, the most commonly mentioned group in the various mentions that we had responses, including from the survey, the interviews, the workshop, and various member meetings with CEE members. Small business was the next highest group, and then again renters, rural, non-native speakers, and moderate income users. And in New Zealand, also low income residential came out as the highest, followed by Indigenous populations, which makes sense for the New Zealand context, followed by renters, rural, and then small enterprises in the non-residential sectors. What was quite interesting in New Zealand, which was very different to the US, was that over 50% of mentions were around homeless and homeless shelters, which actually we haven't done all the analysis for the UK and Sweden, but this was quite similar to what came out as kind of priority or most commonly mentioned groups in the UK. But Sweden was very different because, as I said, they have very low or the lowest fuel poverty numbers on earth in Sweden, and thus the interest was more on the very wealthy and the different reasons and barriers why they are hard to reach. So what have we learned so far in the define period? We've learned what some of the most commonly mentioned hard to reach audiences are. That does not yet necessarily mean that these are going to be the priority audiences for each of the countries. More work needs to be done around the characterization and learning about the various demographics, psychographics, and country contexts and dimensions that are affecting them in order to be able to pinpoint that. And some of the key barriers that have been mentioned by our various hard-to-reach experts were trust or mistrust of authorities specifically, language and energy literacy issues, reaching and engaging property owners, and the split incentive issue, which is an issue both in the residential and the non-residential sector. Cultural barriers can be particularly an issue when you're dealing with Indigenous populations. And then one of the most commonly mentioned barriers was conflicting priorities, either by being in such a vulnerable position that energy efficiency really is the lowest priority on your list, even if it could help you, for example, by paying bills or whatever. It's just more important to put food on the table or dealing with health issues, for example, especially now. And then there is also some respondents who said some people simply don't care, and this can refer to some of the very wealthy who don't have issues with paying their utility bills, but not necessarily and not always. So the next steps we're going to take is to create a summary report from the survey data and stakeholder interviews. We're currently in the process of writing a literature review that specifically focuses on how to reach definitions and the various audiences. And the results from both will lead to a development of hard to reach audience characterizations, which are going to help policymakers specifically. In year 2, we're going to go into an in-depth case study analysis and start on some field research pilots, hopefully. So, this is now leading us a little bit into some of the connections between this research and this new world that we're currently finding ourselves in. In the past, when I gave presentations, I was, especially when I was running the first global research collaboration on behavior change in DSM for the predecessor of the users TCP, which was the IEA DSM program. And during my presentations, I often joked that in task 24, which was what that research was called, that behavior changes everything, because I had a very broad definition of energy behavior and behavior change. And under that definition, it kind of did mean everything. But in this current instance that we're finding ourselves, until we do find a technological solution such as a vaccine, behavior change really is everything, including the difference between life and death. And more than 3 billion people in the world are currently sticking to very strict lockdown rules, with all their terrible negative side effects, because they do understand that staying home saves lives, including those of the most vulnerable, of our essential workers, and especially also our heroes in the health services. And many of these people are regarded as hard to reach, or were regarded as hard to reach when it comes to engaging them in energy efficiency or conservation measures. And due to the economic consequences of shutting down whole countries, the numbers will be greatly increased. And so I'll try and point to some of the links very carefully and without trying to overstate my research, because it obviously hasn't really been done in this space yet, and we're just in the beginning of starting to uncover some of these links, and much more work will need to be done, including in this annex. But some of the links were some of the recommendations and the interventions, the behavioural interventions we are testing in field research pilots in this research, may be able to help alleviate some of the economic, social, health and environmental burdens that some of those vulnerable audiences, our energy users, are dealing with in the fallout of this crisis. So there are some obvious connections and links between global pandemics and global issues like climate change. There are some common causes around habitat destruction. Health inequity causes a lot of problems. The inequity between the global north and the global south is causing, obviously, massive unfair issues. It also causes different responses that we need to take. The same behavioural changes that work in the global north in response to this pandemic are not going to be the ones that work in the global south. And it's the same with energy and climate change behaviours. And ultimately, systems change is what we want to achieve, because human health and planetary health are very much interconnected, and we do need to deal with some of those environmental crises to improve the social and health equity issues as well, and particularly to build resilience and create global cohesion. So some specific concerns for this research are around the importance of behaviour change in global crisis and to protect the most vulnerable, the usefulness of behavioural and social science when we're messaging those kind of audiences, the difficulty in changing habits, except during moments of change or disruptions like the one we're finding ourselves in now, the importance of trust in science and trusted messengers, such as public health professionals, who are hugely important right now, and also highlighting some of the co-benefits of energy efficiency and conservation and how it can help us in recovery efforts and in embedding long-term behavioural and systems changes and help us transition to a sustainable energy system, which is still the target of the Paris Accord and a lot of national agreements and targets. So why do we respond more to something like this pandemic than we do to something that is widely recognized as an issue like climate change? One of the reasons is that energy consumption, which is one of the main drivers for greenhouse gas emission, is invisible, it's abstract. Kilowatt hours really mostly make sense for electrical engineers, but not so much for the general population. It's non-sensory, it doesn't violate our social sensibilities in the same case, it doesn't cause this instinctive fear response. The deaths from climate change seem to be like one step removed and part of natural causes. There is also a slow time scale, which means that we adjust to some of those new normal extreme weather events or bushfires, or the fact that corals are now bleaching every year. I'm a coral biologist by training, and you know, this has been utterly unprecedented, the amount of bleaching that the Great Barrier Reef, for example, is currently experiencing. It's also a much more fast-moving threat that we're dealing with right now. We need an immediate response. There's no time to sow any kind of distrust. We really need to pull together right now. There are really clear strategies of how we can deal with this pandemic. There is a priority list of behaviors that we can change, and also nations can go it alone and have different responses, much more so than with climate change. And the other thing that needs to be said is that there really is no end in sight in some of the behavioral changes that we need to embed for, you know, the systems transition, the energy systems transition, for example. I mean, there is not going to be a post climate change. I mean, there's going to be a post climate change world at some stage probably, but not in the very near future at all. And then obviously energy efficiency and conservation is just not that high on the list of priorities of most people. And it has to be said that at this point, some of the policy changes that are required to mitigate climate change appear actually a lot less disruptive than the measures that are being taken right now to tackle COVID. So where we can use energy efficiency and conservation to help us with the resilience and recovery efforts, we probably should really try and figure out how we can do that. Why behavior change is so hard? Why is there such an energy efficiency gap, which is the gap between the unexploited economic potential for energy efficiency and what's technically feasible versus what is actually achieved in terms of energy savings? There are various market failures like environmental externalities, inefficient pricing of energy, lack of information, principal agent issues, systemic behavioral biases in consumer decision-making. They're all reasons why this is the case. And behavioral economics is a new buzz which is addressing some of these issues. It's even won a Nobel Prize, but needs to be pointed out that other social scientists have long highlighted the issues when we're focusing on designing technologies without really understanding the people who are going to use those technologies. And so why do we put so much more emphasis and funding into technology than people-focused research? Between 1990 and 2018, the natural and technical sciences received 770% more funding than social sciences for research that were related to climate change, for example, and only 0.12% of all research funding was spent on the social science of climate mitigation. And that really needs to change because they are intrinsically interlinked, those socio-technical issues. There is another issue in the sense that we focus our main policy interventions and a lot of research around what's called the deficit model and also rational choice theory. This is the idea that there is an information and financial deficit, and if you provide information and funding, then behavior change will follow because people are utility maximizing rational creatures. And if we've learned anything from out of decades of behavioral science, it is that humans, especially around the energy usage, are definitely not rational in the way that some of those neoclassical economists envisage them to be. And one of the reasons why this is particularly the case around energy is because most energy use, something like 90 to 95% is estimated to actually be habitual or routine rather than rational, which makes it particularly hard to change when you're trying to tackle it with those kind of deficit models. And a lot of social psychology models do not actually feature habit at all. So there is a time when energy habits can actually change, and it is during such moments of change or disruption. And what that means is it's been found that particular life events represent moments of disruption to people's routines, and they can serve as windows of opportunity in which you can deliver interventions when people may be more able or willing to do things differently. And I'm not necessarily just talking about this pandemic response right now. I'm talking about things like changing jobs, moving house, becoming pregnant, retiring from work, taking in elderly or sick people to care for. These are all kind of transitions when people's daily routines are disrupted and need to be reconsidered before new routines emerge. And there is increasing evidence that habit change interventions that are delivered at these moments of change can be more effective than when they're delivered at any other time. And this is something we can definitely see right now, because the world has completely changed in the moment of this disruption. So as I said, the main driver for the pandemic response to date is around behaviour change. 13 specific behaviours were targeted. They were grouped into hygiene and touching, self-isolation and social distancing, healthcare and food safety. Particularly self-isolation and social distancing has led to huge changes in travel behaviour, and we already heard feedback that this has led to massive reduction in air pollution. You've seen the maps. I've put the one from China up on the top, but we've seen them in Italy and other places as well. But that is obviously not to say that this pandemic was good for the environment, because it led to massive other issues, of course. And no pandemic is good for health, even if it reduces air pollution, which, you know, kills a lot of people as well. But there are other moments of change in people's lives where trusted messengers or middle actors, such as public health officials or people like tradespeople or service people, can actually provide the right messaging and help deliver interventions. And acting on such moments of change and identifying and engaging trusted messengers is one of the main recommendations that's already coming out of this research. Oops. So I'm going to finish up with some lessons for this research. I'm expecting there's going to be some negative impact from the pandemic on this annex, like there is on most people in the world and most research efforts. Obviously, it'll be hard to do field research pilots when there is a lockdown. Funding may be even harder to come by. Our national experts are obviously dealing with a lot of other priorities, but there are also some upshots and opportunities. So I think this is probably the biggest global moment of change that we have seen yet, and the response has been incredible. The rapid, massive behavior change responses have already been shown to work. In a lot of countries, there has been a considerable flattening of the curve of infections following various behavioral measures. The trust in science and public health authorities is really high in the moment, which is good, because they're keeping us safe. We also need to be careful that we're not overhyping behavioral science right now or energy efficiency, because obviously you want to be very careful that in response to this specific pandemic, that public health authorities have and epidemiologists have the first say. There were some issues in the UK around, you know, the nudge unit being involved potentially with the herd immunity and behavioural fatigue issues around a slower response. There is also some issues that are coming out when certain energy efficiency messaging is still going out to people, for example, via home energy reports, that are, you know, very incongruous right now with what people are facing. Doing expensive energy efficiency retrofits, for example, right now is not a great time, or you're not allowed to let tradespeople into your house in the moment anyway. So being careful around messaging is really important. We are definitely targeting some of the same energy behaviours that have currently been part of this lockdown for our hard to reach audiences. For example, reduced flying is definitely something non-essential long haul flights that we're focusing on with the very wealthy. Teleworking is something that, has been considered for other social and economic co-benefits potentially. But there are many other interventions that we cannot be communicating right now in the immediacy of the lockdown, but that can definitely help provide more resilience and also improve health and help with the recovery effort after. And obvious examples are insulation, weatherization, clean heating, switching to renewables, but also various energy conservation efforts that can help with utility bills. So it is important that we focus on some of these co-benefits of energy efficiency and conservation, particularly in light of the recovery efforts. And what happens next will really determine our future. If we do what we did as a globe after the global financial crisis, where all macroeconomic and individual behaviours have rebounded to even more consumption and extractive industries, we will see more devastating global crises, including pandemics. And so right now we actually have the biggest chance in generations to right some of the social, environmental and economic ills and create a just and sustainable energy system that works for all energy users. And this is the thought that I'd like to leave you with. And thank you so much for listening. Really appreciating that you're all here, and I look forward to answering your questions.